Morning, Dianne.
Good morning.
So, just a couple of things. Thank you, and lovely to see everybody. It's so important to see your faces. We miss you guys, and we're back soon here at the library with very specific rules about how we do things. But we'd love to see you here at the library in any way that you can come in. I'd like to thank Sandrine for being here with us. Thank you, Sandrine. It's great taking care of all the technology. And before I introduce Dianne, very, very wonderful speaker today, I'd like to just mention that it is the 8th of May. This is victory in Europe after the Second World War. Difficult times. I think we can all think about that for a minute. I don't think I'll give a minute of silence because but during your day, maybe acknowledge that terrible, terrible, terrible war that went on. Thank you, Dianne. Good morning.
Good morning.
Good to have you. Great to have you. Oh, hold on, Sandrine.
Yes, Phoebe, you don't want to record the thing?
I'm recording right now.
Okay, all right. Sorry.
But I will mention, everybody, I am recording and theoretically we're going to place this up onto our YouTube channel. If you do not want to be seen on the YouTube channel or heard, you should turn off your video and your audio. Okay, thank you. Back to Dianne. How are you, Dianne, this morning?
Pretty good, thank you. It's sunny and warm in London, but we're all locked in like you are.
When are you locked out? When do you get to? No news?
No news, no, but not straight away. Certainly, I think we've got probably weeks, if not months, to go.
Wow.
We've got the highest death rate in Europe, so they're a bit nervous.
Right. Let me introduce Dianne. Thank you for being with us. Dianne is the Labour's deputy leader in the House of Lords. She has a PhD in history. She has written a number of books. And we discussed about what would be most interesting for our community. And we asked Dianne to talk about Brexit today. Another one of those terrible situations that we have. What we'll do is have Dianne speak and then we'll open up to questions. So as Dianne goes forward, please do write down your questions and we'll open up the questions to you. Dianne, thank you for coming. This is our library lockdown lectures and it's very exciting to have you on our screen.
Well, thank you for that, and thank you for getting me to think about something other than the virus, which has rather taken over our lives. Phoebe, as you've said, it is 1945 anniversary today, and perhaps it's a particularly poignant moment to be looking at Brexit and about Britain's role in the European Union, given how important 1945 was to the creation of what we now call the European Union. Obviously, it went through a number of titles and names before it got there. I thought I'd title my talk today, Understanding Britain, or How the Hell We Took Leave of Our Senses. Because I think you all knew that we did it, but it's really quite hard to explain why. And it is hard to know really where that story began. Whether it is partly our island's geography, we are an island, our former ownership of America. Sorry, Americans watching this, but we did used to own you. But therefore that common language and shared cultural experience, which made us always perhaps more Atlanticists than some other EU countries. Our religion, which has been different from mainstream Europe on the whole, our former world role. There's clearly a good PhD to be written about that. I've finished with PhDs, but if you know any students, there are still some interesting questions to be asked. But I think it does mean that that combination of things meant that we were probably from the very start reluctant Europeans. And I don't mean European in the nice phrase of just being part of the continent. When I'm talking about Europe, I'm obviously meaning the European Community or the European Union or whatever it was, the different names. And of course, right from the start, from the anniversary that we're celebrating and commemorating today, Britain had won the war, and that had an enormous psychological impact. Now, partly it means in itself, but also it means that we didn't share the centuries-old German-French experience. And we had to remember that there'd been 3 within what they would then have thought was recent memory, major disputes, because of course there was 1870, which wasn't that much before the 1914 outbreak, and then 1939 to 45. And those 3, but particularly the last 2, of course, drove a motivation to change the relationships across the continent that I think we're sort of missing, if you like, from the United Kingdom perspective. The other thing was that even in 45, we still had a big navy, we had a global trade role, and we also had very close Commonwealth ties, not just to India, but also Australia, Canada, and New Zealand. And not only were those important for our own trade, but of course in 45, we owed them an enormous debt. They had risen to the call, actually in both wars, but particularly in the memory of the time in 45, and had fought alongside and had enormous losses, particularly I think Australia and New Zealand numerically. So that contribution, and of course they fed us during the Second World War, I think was part of the UK psyche. And that, I think, is some of the background about why we were reluctant joiners. And the pro-EU, or what it was called differently at the time, was led at that time, which is also important for where we get to later on, but with some notable exceptions. Much of that pro-European, pro-community view was led very much by business, by the establishment, if you like, by conservatives, who saw the economic sense of it. And it started very much as an economic, obviously, community. And that part of it, of the drive, explains some of the things that happened later on. But even in 1975, that was when we had a referendum. We didn't have an in-out referendum. We went into, you'll all know this, I'm sure, very familiar. We went into the EEC without a referendum. The referendum we held in 1975 was whether to stay in. And at that stage, the stay in was again very much led by the establishment. The church, the CBI, the CBI represents our British business, all the sort of people that appear on the BBC, all the commentariats, and indeed, apart from the Communist Morning Star, I think all the British papers, there's one other, I think maybe the Yorkshire Post, but all the British papers in the time of the 75 referendum were in favour of staying in. But it was a sort of establishment view. For, if you like, the less establishment side, for the Labour Party, they had long been split on this. They were split when we went in, and they will remain split in 19. We went in obviously in 73, and maybe I'll say I was in Brussels on the 1st of January 1973 as the flags went up. but that was quite a minority view in the Labour Party. Labour was very split on the European Union. There was a more social democratic, the sort of right of the Labour Party was more in favour, and the left of the Labour Party, there were exceptions on both sides, obviously, but on the whole it was the more social democratic group that were pro-European. There were, as I say, some exceptions, like where Gateskill finally came down to, but the left was much more against membership of the European Union. They saw it as a capitalist club, a business club, again, a reflection of the sort of people that they'd seen us taking us in, being good for business, free competition, which at that time we were quite an interventionist party. And there were even some in the Labour Party who wanted socialism in one country and thought that the open borders would not help that. So the left within the Labour Party, but it was the majority view then, were against our membership. And that influenced, in fact, how we joined the Labour Party. My own personal story, I was saying I was in Brussels on the 1st of January 1973 as the Union flag went up. And I was there because we were then negotiating to bring together and to merge two trade union bodies. There was at that point the EFTA TUC, which was obviously the confederation, if you like, all the TUCs from across the EFTA countries, because the countries who hadn't joined up at the beginning of the EEC had formed EFTA, the European Free Trade Area, and the trade unions across those countries were in the EFTA TUC, and then there was the ECFTU, which brought together the equivalents of the TUC from across what was then the 6 countries within the EEC. And it was called the European Confederation of Free Trade Unions because in those days the communist unions were quite different. So, for example, within France, only 2 of the 3 confederations were in the ECFTU, the F being the non-communist, and there was one other of the French confederations was in the, I think it's called the World, I've forgotten the name now, but it was the communist trade unions were members of that. And again, that goes back to where we were through the Cold War and all of that. But anyway, there was the ECFTU that covered the 6 countries that had been in the European Economic Community up till 1973, and then there were the FTUC. What at that point, thinking very much about the growth of the European Union as it was to become, the push was that just the new countries joining in 1973, only the trade unions from those 3 countries, which were obviously Denmark, Ireland, and the United Kingdom, only the TUCs from those 3 countries should join the existing 6-country body. But the TUC, which was the biggest of all the confederations across the whole of the ECFT, the EFTA and the EEC areas, said no, because they were reluctant at that stage to take such a pro-European Union position. And what we did instead, we merged, and that was why I was there to work on, we merged the 2 unions, the 2 confederations, so that the emergent body, which was called the ETUC, which is still there, of course, though it's now obviously much bigger and got the old communist unions in, but at the time, the ETUC, the TUC was the biggest member of it, and it was absolutely clear it didn't want to be just a European Union body. So it had both the new countries, the 9 countries, in other words, that were then in the European Union, but also the others like Norway and Switzerland and Austria that hadn't joined up. Interestingly, of course, that was, though we didn't know it at the time, it was the forerunner of what we now see, which is the European Economic Area. Again, no one's ever made the connection that the union started that. Another PhD for somebody else. But even when we'd done that, and the TUC had achieved its aim of not being so European Union focused in that new confederation, the British trade unions still boycotted, and did the Labour Party boycotted or empty-chaired the European Union bodies. So, for example, at that point, the TUC refused to take up its seats on what was then called the European Economic and Social Committee. And that was the first time I was made redundant, because my job had been to work with the TUC members of the European Economic and Social Committee, and they didn't take them up. So I left and was made redundant. I then moved on to Paris, but that's another story. Anyway, the unions and indeed the Labour Party remained very reluctant. And it was really only when Jacques Delors altered the narrative, if you like, or the language of what was going on in the what was still then the EEC, with his concentration on workers' rights. And it was only really then that the unions, and of course at that point the unions completely controlled policy within the Labour Party, and the unions began to change. Some of them also, of course, it was their own experience that led to that move. Many of the, particularly at official level, unions were working, for example, in the EU, across the EU union groupings, the European Metal Workers Federation or the European Transport Workers Federation. And they had, by working with their European colleagues, become much more sympathetic to realizing how European or EEC rules could actually be of assistance to workers. So that the beginnings was there, but it really took a severe election defeat, and the election of the leader of the Labour Party, of Neil Kinnock, who had formerly been a very anti-European, and again, European there, I mean the institution, not the countries. It was only with the election of Neil Kinnock that the change in Labour Party began, and that Labour Party policy, that and defence, began to change because he realised the Labour Party was completely out of step with the British electorate, and that we were never going to be trusted to run the government if we didn't change our policy. And that was a long march for the Labour Party, from a very anti to a very pro position. Though there was always a rump within the anti-group, amongst whom was that former long-term backbencher, Jeremy Corbyn. But there did remain that, if you like, hostile group to the European Union. So that's sort of background to the Labour Party position. In parallel, of course, there was always a strong anti-group within the Tory party. It was the Tory party, albeit with help from Labour, the Tory party that took us into the European Union, with help from a minority in Labour, obviously, but there was always a strong anti-group within the Labour Party. Most of whom it was, of some of whom it was an issue of sovereignty, that, you know, Britain was best, Britain was strongest, and we shouldn't be part of anything that gave away any sovereignty. For others, it was the Commonwealth and the links, strong links to the Commonwealth, that made them worry about that. Some of them were very pro-Atlanticist and thought that our links with America were so important. So there wasn't a particular one view, but there was always that view within the Tory party that made them hostile to perhaps to begin with, not to membership once we'd gone in, but to any closer integration. And really, when in the 90s we talked about the economic and monetary union and political union, and the words ever closer union absolutely frightened them. They didn't want that, and they didn't want, and there were discussions sometimes about a defence force and things like that, and particularly the pro-Americans, the very pro-Atlanticists, didn't like the trend that they saw happening. That group slowly gained real traction. Obviously, Nigel Farage to begin with. He felt the Tory party wasn't strongly enough against, so he set up UKIP, and they then won seats in the European Parliament, and that completely freaked the Tory party, and that maybe is the moment that the Tory party felt they just had to accommodate and move towards satisfying this anti-European group and move to a much more hostile position and to try and bring those voters back in. They promised an in-out referendum. Actually, that was first suggested by the Liberal Democrats, who tend to forget about that now, but the Conservatives agreeing to that was a seismic moment. The people who agreed to it never believed it would happen. They also believed that they would win, that the pro-EU would win. And it was really a sop to the antis rather than taking on the arguments and making the case for Europe. We then had the referendum. The Conservatives led the campaign. It was a complete disaster. It was run, and I'm sorry I have to say this, it was run by men in suits, and it was all about the economy. It didn't speak to women, it didn't speak to consumers, it didn't speak about workers' rights. It was very apologetic. It was a very bad campaign. Those of us involved in it at the time knew that it wasn't going to work. I think I knew certainly by March, and the referendum was in June, I knew by March we'd lost. There was a lot of denial in people's heads, but it was fairly obvious. And of course, we were faced by a very simplistic group on the other side. The Out campaign focused absolutely on immigration. I had, to begin with, thought that wouldn't have as much traction. Well, not at that point, but a few years ago, because traditionally our immigration was against people who didn't look like us, and given that the immigrants from across the European Union on the whole look exactly like us, but I think we had all underestimated the sheer numbers of people that did come, mostly from further east, of course, from Poland, and what this meant to communities. A lot of them were working in quite small towns, and therefore I remember a friend of mine in Ipswich whose children at that point were probably primary school, because she was certainly taking them to school, and she one day, and she was still is a very, very, very pro-EU person for all sorts of reasons, but she was taking her kids to school in a village not very far from Ipswich. And she realised there was only one other mum dropping off their kids speaking English as a first language. And I think that, you know, we underestimated the impact that was having in communities, particularly those of us in London, where we were much used to multicultural, our European migrant people living in London tended to be much more middle class. They spoke English, they were in different sort of jobs around the country, where they were much more in rural areas and unskilled, not English speaking. They were younger and had children, and therefore the impact was being felt in schools. There were reasons that people felt that that something had happened that they weren't in charge of. So there were, my own view still is that much of that vote was not actually about the European Union, but about some long-standing issues that, you know, as politicians, particularly in Labour, we have to take a lot of blame for why we hadn't heard of them. During the referendum itself, Labour's voice was hardly heard. Jeremy Corbyn, of course, found it very difficult to campaign. He wasn't particularly pro, but he wouldn't let the rest of the party off the leash to campaign enthusiastically either. So there was a very silent voice from a more working class, pro-women, pro-consumer, pro-campaign, really never got going, and we lost, as you know. Prime Minister then immediately resigned, Cameron resigned, and he was replaced by a very weak Prime Minister. Mrs. May was very weak. She was obviously herself a pro-European, although hadn't campaigned, but she had a small majority in the Commons, and she then made every mistake in the book. She, even before she'd entered into negotiations, she set out some infamous red lines of leaving the customs union and the single market. I think she didn't understand it, and certainly had no understanding of what that would mean for the country, but even more for Northern Ireland. She then, having great difficulties herself in her party, she called an election, partly because Jeremy Corbyn was so unpopular. She looked at the polls and she thought she could win, and she thought that would give her a big enough majority to be able to get her withdrawal deal through the Commons. Of course, she was a complete disaster during the election, and she virtually lost it, not quite, but it almost lost the campaign and left her in an even weaker position in the Commons. At which point, the very hard anti-Europeans, the European Reform Group in the Commons, decided they'd never back her agreement. And then, along with Labour, who had different reservations about the agreement Mrs. May had got, very worried about our manufacturing bases in the north, which of course it was where a lot of Labour seats were, a lot of our trade unionists were, and our manufacturing base is very important. How that would manage outside the customs union, worries about consumer and employment rights, worried about the environment, didn't like the deal, but along with, it was a very strange alliance, effectively voted down Mrs. May's agreement, and that led her to resign. Boris Johnson came in, he sort of pretended to get a new deal. Actually, the new deal is almost the same as the old deal, only worse, because it effectively puts a line between us and Northern Ireland. But he got that accepted, he had an election, and as you know, he won, causing enormous damage to Labour, indeed in our Brexit supporting seats, who felt basically we hadn't listened to them. We hadn't listened the first time, and we hadn't listened the second time. So even while all this was going on, Labour had its difficulties holding together. We won seats, particularly in 2017, in universities, and what's extraordinary, particularly in 2017, but even in 2019, we won a lot of seats in London. We won seats basically in all the towns, all the cities, virtually all the towns that had a university, Labour won. In other words, all the pro-European seats other than Scotland, Labour won. And that was really difficult, particularly after 2017, because our membership is in those areas. Our membership is a middle class, pro-European membership. Our Labour voters are much more working class, but also were much more Brexit. So this was a really difficult divide. The Liberal Democrats that we thought were threatening us came out in favour of a second referendum, and I'm afraid I have some regrets about this. The idea of a second referendum, in a sense, took over our time. We were trying to deal with that split because there were people in the Labour Party not in favour of a second referendum because they knew that wasn't very popular in their areas. There was a very pro-European group in the Labour Party who wanted a referendum, and it meant that became a lot of discussion points within our internal Labour Party instead of looking at how the negotiations were going and how else we should win back our seats. That's not a Brexit issue, it's an issue for Labour some other time. Talking of which, I better see how I'm doing time-wise. So what are we now facing as far as Brexit goes? I am running out of time, I'll try and be quick. what are we now facing? In our parliament, we've got a 80-seat Conservative majority in the Commons. That puts Labour in a very, very weak position. We can't really dent any government decision about how we're going to leave the transition period. The government could decide that we're going to just end the transition without a deal, straight onto WTO trade, with tariffs, customs posts and all of that. And the truth is, there's very little Labour can do in the Commons. Even in the Lords, and we made enormous difference before, we really couldn't do anything because any difference we make, any votes we have, even if we could have them, and it's very difficult at the moment because we're not meeting in practice, only virtually, but with the size of the majority in the Commons, anything we do would be overtaken. So we're facing the current timetable is the third round of talks on the future deal will take place next week. And then there's only one more round of discussions. They start on the 1st of June before there's any decision in June on whether to extend the transition. And all those talks at the moment are anyway happening virtually, which is really very difficult. And in one sense, there's no urgency about the talks because the government seems absolutely determined, and if it remains determined, that it will not have an extension to the transition no matter what, then in a sense we've got more time about reaching an agreement. On the other hand, there's an enormous urgency because if the government does hold to that and we come out of the transition in December, businesses are desperate. I mean, they're in real dire situation at the moment anyway, but they need time to prepare. There's going to be tariffs, if there's going to be new procedures, new paperwork, new data exchange rules, the rules of origin. It's not just a form filling, but you have to ascertain how much of each good was actually made by products made within the EU and how much from outside. These are really complicated things, particularly for small and medium-sized enterprises. All of that, the businesses need time to gear up. And of course, that is of, without looking at about the needs of our respective citizens, such as you, living in each other's countries. Some of the citizens' issues have been resolved, but there are major ones, particularly for the Brits living elsewhere in the EU. I think we've dealt much more with EU nationals living within the UK. We're almost there, not saying it's complete, but I think we'll be there. But for Brits living in other EU countries, particularly if they will want to move at some other time, either to live or work in a different EU country from where they are at the moment, that's a big unresolved issue. Now, the European Union, for our generation perhaps, or even more, not mine, but for our grandchildren's generation, is very much about people. It is about moving. It is about, well, I don't need to tell this audience. Anyway, the situation is that this should be a people's Europe, and they're the people maybe with most uncertainties at the moment. And what we're facing now is this, in addition to all of that, we've got now a real global financial and humanitarian crisis. For whatever we're looking at, what the pandemic means in the UK is almost nothing. If you look at Syria and Yemen, Africa, I mean, Ethiopia, Eritrea, this is devastating. This is, put aside the health, just the economic issues there. We've then got the international virus and what that means for health, and all that at a stage where the UK government is pulling up the drawbridge and working less internationally than perhaps we've needed at any other time since the stay in 1945. So that's a pretty glum story. Happy VE Day to you all.
Thank you, Dianne. Oof, thank you. I think I'll go back to bed. No. I love the expression drawing up the drawbridge. It's a great metaphor. Hadn't heard that one before. Oh, yeah. I have just a question, and then we'll pass on to everybody. You guys can think of if you have anything to ask Dianne. Can you give us the situation with Scotland and Ireland? I know those are two different, very separate countries, but can you wrap that into a nutshell?
Well, as far as my mic's on, yes. As far as the European Union goes, Scotland is in a sense not an issue. It is part and parcel. All the rules will apply. As far as our relationship, the European Union comes concerned. I'll come on to a different issue over Scotland, but as far as the European Union, Northern Ireland, of course, is completely different. And it is really hard to work out what the protocol on Northern Ireland how that will work out, because they're trying to make sure that there's no border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. But actually, if you've got free movement, whether of people or indeed of goods between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland, but on different rules from Northern Ireland to Great Britain. If there are any, I think they're mostly Brits, but if there are any Americans here who aren't aware of that subtlety of UK and GB, we tend to use them interchangeably. But of course, GB is just Wales, Scotland, and England. Although we often use GB to mean, like on our cars, you'll see GB. It doesn't mean GB. But we use, but GB technically is that. And United Kingdom is the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. So GB will work to a different set of rules after we come out. We won't be following EU rules going forward, European Union rules going forward. But it is said that Northern Ireland will, so that they can have free movement with the Republic of Ireland. Because basically, if you're going to have different rules between Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland, you'd have to have a border. Nobody wants that. And similarly with people. At the moment, the cars, the buses, the trains go across. But if you don't have checks, and anyone can just, from the European Union, fly into Dublin and then take a train to Belfast and then take the ferry over to Holyhead or Swansea, effectively there will be an open border. And therefore, the only way around that would be to have a border down the Irish Sea. So that would mean there'd be passports between Northern Ireland and the rest of GB, which of course is also unacceptable to everybody. So we've ended up in a position I can't really begin to understand how they're going to sort that. So that is a big unresolved issue that the government keeps telling us not to worry about, but I worry about it all the time. Northern Ireland and Great Britain has enormous amount of trade. We have a lot of agricultural produce, but a lot of other stuff that comes from Northern Ireland and vice versa. So the idea of either tariffs or checks between GB and Northern Ireland is problematic, and without them, it's very worrying about how the freedom of movement could take place between Northern Ireland and the Republic. There is an issue over Scotland and Wales, and I'm from Wales, so I'm quite involved in this anyway, which is how we keep a common market within the United Kingdom. When we went into what was then the EEC in 1973, we had no devolution at all. So, for example, our agricultural policy or lots of other policies, there was only United Kingdom policy. In the period since we've been in the European Union, we've had devolution, and areas like agriculture have been devolved. But they were devolved, save they must always keep to EU rules. So although they were theoretically devolved, the Welsh and Scots could never have a different agricultural policy to what was happening in the EU. So that was controlled by the EU. As soon as we come out of the EU, agriculture would go to Scotland, go to Wales. Bits of it, it's slightly different, would go to Northern Ireland. Leave that to one side, it's slightly complicated, but go to Scotland and to Wales. But if those countries have their own agricultural policy, we could again see borders in the sense between Wales and England, which has got a very long land border. If the rules on sheep and when is a lamb mutton and when is it lamb, or I don't know, or any rules about how often they have to be inoculated against whatever you inoculate sheeps against. Sorry, there may be farmers who understand all this on the call, I don't know. But if you don't have the same rules, effectively you wouldn't have a common market within the United Kingdom. So the position on Scotland and Wales at the moment are some very tricky discussions of whether these devolved nations are going to give to the United Kingdom some rules that would otherwise be devolved. For myself, I think the issue of independence for Scotland is off the agenda at the moment. I think just with the economic crisis, I don't think anyone's going to be pushing for a referendum there just now.
A great period of uncertainties.
Yeah.
So we have two options to open up questions to everybody. One is that we see you on the screen and you can say, hello, can I speak? Put up your finger so we can see. And the other option is if you're not running your video, we can't see you. And so, Sandrine, do they send a message to you saying, open up my mic? Or do open up your mic?
The easiest would be maybe at the bottom of the screen, they have a réaction option, and they can wave, they can lift their thumb, something show us that they're reacting to something, and I can turn the mic on.
And if you're very polite, you can just open up your mic and we'll
exactly.
Let's see, we have 24 people come on this. This is great. Thank you for coming, everybody. Anybody have a question?
Or a comment? I'm very happy to have just a comment that doesn't need an answer.
Okay, I think Tony's saying something. Tony, you have to open up your mic. Tony.
Let me open it up for you, Tony. Let me see. I can't see you anymore. Where are you? There you are.
Okay.
There you go, Tony.
I've got a question. With the Conservative administration now in power, do you think that with this Brexit, they're just going to pull the plug out on everything and not have any relations at all with the EU? Or will they, because we're all kind of, at the moment, we have been very friendly with each other. Students can go here and there. Everybody has a right to work in the whichever country belongs to the EU. Do you think that they're actually going to pull the plug out on all that kind of thing and not try and retain some of their connections with the European Union?
I think there's two ways of answering that. One about people and one about the rest. On people, I'm absolutely sure they will end free movement. The immigration was such an important part of the referendum to them that they, I think, will be very unwilling to continue the free movement of EU citizens into the UK. And frankly, if we don't let Europeans into the UK, why would any European Union let us in their countries? So I think in the short term, there will be, there won't be a willingness to move back to a free movement. I think that's for them a really big issue, and is quite a big difference between them and the Labour Party. But I'd be surprised to move. On the more general one, I'm very confused. In fact, we've got a big debate on Tuesday in the Lords on this about the wider relationship between, if you like, government to governments, because over defence, over justice, one of the areas I'm working with is over families. We have an enormous number now of split families across the EU. People move, they have babies, they change jobs, and we've had some really good arrangements that where in a court where people, particularly, it's really where parents are splitting up, either a court ruling on maintenance or on access to the kids, those sorts of issues. Across the EU, one court recognises the judgments of another. So if, for example, a Polish father goes back to Poland, the agreement, the divorce agreement or the maintenance agreement is in the UK, that he would pay that much, that the kids would spend, I don't know, summer holidays with him, or whatever the agreement is, the Polish family court doesn't try and reopen that. So you can't get round, if you like, one jurisdiction by moving to another area. And our people working with families are immensely worried about this, over fostering, over adoption, over, as I say, split families. And every time we talk to the ministers and we say, look, you know, these issues need resolving, they say, yes, yes, we really take these as a priority. And every time we say, well, where's the deal? They say, we haven't got it yet. So I'm unsure whether it's that the government simply doesn't have the bandwidth, even more now with the virus, to deal with the range of complexity of problems that are enormous, or whether there's a reluctance to do it. With Mrs. May, people who knew her told me she understood this well. She'd been our Home Secretary, I think, for 5 years, certainly for a long time. Therefore, she'd worked on all sorts of, not just terrorism, but a lot of confidential stuff on chasing various criminals, money, data protection, that she was well on top of it and took it seriously. The people who talk about Boris Johnson say he's never been a detail man, doesn't know any of this, and he won't even understand the issues he's not dealing with. And they fear they will fall out, not out of attitude, but out of, I don't want to say stupidity, but carelessness, you know. So the government tell us they want to keep cooperating with member states. They tell us they want to have good relationship. But I have to say, at the moment, we're simply not seeing the evidence of that.
Yeah. How important then are the ties with the Commonwealth then? Are they, I mean, I don't know how strong they are. I mean, once we joined the EEC, you know, back in 1970, do they kind of drop all Commonwealth, or with trade agreements, or are they still in force?
There's still a lot of trade. I mean, much less than there was. And my New Zealand friends particularly tell me it was the best thing that ever happened. You know, they were very angry at the beginning because of loss of preferential trading. But actually, they opened up to the Asiatic markets and, you know, are actually much more robust now.
Yes.
But other relationships with the Commonwealth are still very strong. Whether when our dear Queen passes on they will remain so, I don't know, because she's been a very, very solid supporter of it. But the Commonwealth still runs out of the UK. It's still a very strong, some of it is part of the Five Eyes, so over defence is important. So it's probably more cultural than trade at the moment.
Yeah.
But it certainly hasn't disappeared. But going forward, it's hard to know. Our relationship with India is perhaps the most important trade-wise. There are only economists there. I don't know whether I got the figures right, but we are enormously dependent on India for an amazing amount of trade, and particularly in some of our high-tech areas as well. Specialist IT, a lot runs out of India now. So I think that relationship will remain important.
Yes, yeah.
Can I add one point? Sorry about this.
Yeah.
It was quite interesting that some of our labour areas with big Commonwealth or ex-Commonwealth countries, particularly the Pakistani and the Indian subcontinent voters, were pretty hostile to the European Union. because, you know, and I'll say it because we're talking to French here, a French person could move to London, bring their grandmother over that day. And our Pakistani origin, our Indian origin, and particularly Bangladesh within London, you know, couldn't bring their grandparents over even for a wedding or something. And there was quite a lot of hostility amongst these communities, some of whom are very long standing here, about their inability to bring family over. Whereas the European Union, anyone could turn up and their family. So some of those ties, you know, remain very, very strong.
Yeah. Right.
Anybody else? Any questions?
Don't worry if they're on.
Oh, Nicole has a question.
Okay.
Yes,
Jacqueline as well.
Okay. There'll be
I
next
would like.
Jacqueline.
I would like to know. I would like to have the view of Dianne about French company that, for example, my son has been working for a French company, a European company in Stevenage. And I would like to know if Dianne knows something about what happened in the future to this kind of company.
Stephen, does he live in Stevenage?
Sorry?
Does he live in Stevenage?
Yes, he has been living and working in Stevenage for over 20 years now.
It's quite interesting for some of us. Stevenage is also the home of French wine. Not that it's really made there, but one of the biggest, the Wine Society, which imports a lot of French wine, is based in Stevenage. So a lot of us go there just to get French wine.
Does he work in wine, Nicole?
Sorry?
Does he work in a wine business?
It's a company for satellite.
Okay.
Oh, for satellites.
Engineer for EADS.
Yeah, very good. First of all, about himself. Obviously, anyone who's already working, and particularly that length of time in the UK, I think we've looked after their rights. I don't foresee any problem with French-owned companies. We are much more open to foreign-owned companies. Some of the problems of our particularly our aircraft, whom nobody's flying at the moment. But before all of this, there was a lot of worry that our British aircraft companies, airline companies, couldn't continue with cabotage across the EU because they weren't sufficiently owned by EU owners. Within Britain, we don't tend to have those regulations. We can have wholly foreign-owned companies operating here, and we're pretty relaxed about it, actually. So I would worry less about an EU company operating in the UK than the reverse. We do have a pretty open economy in that way. So I think he and his company are probably okay. I think the issue is much more, if it's about satellites, is how on earth we're going to negotiate those sort of deals for global satellite rights when we're doing it by ourselves rather than, you know, in the much bigger EU, which is one of my many concerns about us not being in the EU. But I think he's
satellites of companies or satellites in the sky?
In the sky. I mean, you know, access to that and to the data exchange. I mean, these are really complex issues, well beyond my comfort zone. But I've just had enough meetings to know how really difficult this is.
We had Jacqueline who had a question.
Yes, I will.
Thank you very much, Dianne.
So Jacqueline, let me turn your mic on.
All right.
There you are.
Tell me, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. I was just wondering, thank you very much first. And then I was wondering if the opinion might change the opinion for those who were in favor of the leave, might change since we have the virus. People might regret having left Europe, because Europe, I hope that Europe will help the people who are part of it, the UE, European, yes, EU, I'm sorry. So don't you think that people might regret having left Europe, having left European community?
There's no evidence at the moment of that at all. In fact, if anything, we're becoming very nationalist. We're really, really proud of our National Health Service. I know you clap every night. We only clap once a week. We only clap. I think you're doing it every night at 7, aren't you?
Yes, we do. So
Yeah,
yes.
we do it at 8 o'clock, but only on a Thursday. And we're very much clapping the NHS. And if anything, I think we're more afraid of borders. I think there's a feeling that we're an island and we should have benefited from that. In fact, we didn't, because we let the airplanes all come in, didn't test anyone. But at the moment, I think it's quite a nationalistic response. And the sort of figures the government is putting out is that we're doing better than Italy or whatever. They don't bother to say that when we're doing worse. But these charts being put up all the time of comparing our country with another country feels to me quite nationalistic. You know, it's a bit uncomfy.
I was thinking from an economic point of view. I was thinking from the economic point of view that it's going to be very, very hard from that aspect, you know. Maybe Europe will help us. We hope so.
I think that that's difficult for the British because we were one of the biggest contributors to the European Union. I think people would worry that we were expected to give more money to the poorer countries. So I think at this moment that feels dreadful in our country, even though we're probably better off than almost any country around the rest of the world. But that's not how it feels. We've got now nearly it's over a quarter. We're heading to a third of our private sector employees are now not working. A third. It's over a quarter. Now they're being paid at the moment. They're what's called furloughed. They're getting 80% of their pay, but that won't continue. But you know, I think that the realization of how much money the government is putting into these things, the universities want money, the farmers want money, theatre and television wants money, manufacturing wants money, hospitality, all wanting money. And I think that if anything, there would be a fear that because we're so much richer than most European Union countries, that if we were still in, the expectation would be that we'd give more money to the European Union rather than being recipients of it. I don't think that's right. I think the most important thing would be to get trade going again. And we need you lot to come on holiday to the UK. Please come. But more than that, is Robert and Annette, are they on? I want to come in August. Please, will France open and let me in August?
Thank you.
But I think that the battle down the hatches would be more of the feeling, I'm afraid.
Thank you.
Dianne, we have one more minute, so I think I'll wrap up unless somebody has a really urgent question. If you missed out on the questions, you can always send them to me and I can try to forward them to Dianne. Dianne, we are honored, really honored that you would take the time when you are grappling with these incredible questions that you have. It's really interesting to find somebody right stick in the middle of all of the storm that comes to us and gives us clarity. Information is so important. It's what libraries try to do best. So thank you, thank you, thank you.
Well, thank you all ever so much. And I say, I do hope to see some of you in August. Please let us in to France. Thank you very much.
So Dianne comes in she says, you have a summer home right here.
We rent one.
Yeah, so you come to our area. Well, we would love to see you here maybe you will lock you down here so you don't go back to London and you could just.
That would have been a much better idea. You should have done that to begin with.
You can enjoy the wine and the. Right. Let's see, Sandra, you want to open up the microphone to everybody so we can give a big round of applause? I think we can do that.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you.
There we go. Well, silent applause. That's okay. Fine. It's okay. Don't worry about it.
Okay. I will love you and leave you. Thank you all very much. And enjoy your bank holiday.
Thank you, Dianne. I'll be in touch. If everybody wants to stay on the screen, I have announcements for the coming Fridays. We can open up the microphone now for everybody if you want. That was interesting, no? Yeah. Fascinating. Okay, so, let me, hold on a second.